Plato's Crito. This dialogue is actually a dialogue that stands within a series of dialogues that represent within the history of literature an example of what's called prison literature. And three other dialogues stand within this. For example, Plato's Apology, the Phaedo, and the Euthyphro could be put into this context, although Socrates isn't in fact in jail, but he's awaiting at the court. He has to go to the court on the charge of impiety, so it's kind of connected to that. There's other examples within history, as you can see in this list, some good examples, some bad examples, but the idea of prison literature is that basically the individual, the author, the protagonist is imprisoned, and certain conversations or certain letters are being sent, or certain a consolation, for example, Boethius writes to himself to try to soothe himself and prepare himself for execution, and other political writings, example, come forth from the jail. Here we have an actual depiction of the jail of Socrates, the prison of Socrates. This is in Athens, Greece, at the Philopapou Hill, and you can go to Athens and you can walk and look at the jail and see where he would have been. It's a very interesting sight to see. So it's an actual historical site where Socrates, the man himself, was, and where he was imprisoned after being convicted on charges, which we see in the Apology. And while in prison, he engages in a number of dialogues, conversations with friends, one of which is recorded in the Crito, which we'll see. Another is in the Phaedo, which I would urge you to read on your own. It recounts Socrates' discussion of immortality, life after death, the soul, and it also discusses his eventual execution by drinking the poison hemlock. So let's move on. The setting is that Socrates has been convicted of charges. This is discussed in the Apology of Plato, which is, apology means the defense, so the Apology is actually Socrates' defense, and you can watch that. So the three charges here are impiety, corruption of the youth, and sophistry. Sophistry is a form of argumentation often used in courts, where basically you're taking the greater argument, let's say your opponent's argument, and you're overturning it with the lesser argument. Basically, you're proving someone who's innocent guilty, or someone who's guilty innocent. So it's a really deceptive form of argumentation which was taught in Athens during the time. He's soon to face execution, and during this particular scenario, his friend Crito arrives at the jail, and he's there to convince Socrates to escape. So the main reason for this is that, well, Socrates is falsely convicted, and really he's convicted by his enemies, and his enemies are really not the most virtuous individuals, and they just want to get rid of Socrates for various reasons. Otherwise, Socrates is beloved among many of the normal Athenians out there. It's really the politicians and the sophists and others who want to get rid of Socrates, and they really do a good job of it, and he ends up in jail at this point, but he has the opportunity to escape. So whether this is historically accurate is uncertain. We do know that Plato was at his actual trial, the Apology, and so he may have known of these particular conversations that went on, specifically because the Athenians that Plato wrote this for would have known this, and he wrote it during the time in which Socrates died, maybe some years after. But so there would have been those alive who would have known of these conversations. So Crito here's his short little biography. He was about the same age as Socrates, and his son Christoboulos was a follower of Socrates, as many of the young youth were in Athens. You'll notice the second charge, he's corruption of the youth. So they say that Socrates has misled these young men, when in fact that Socrates is trying to lead them to think and to reflect, etc. So Crito offers a number of arguments, and remember, Socrates has been unjustly placed in jail. This is central to this entire dialogue, the idea that we have a man who is innocent, I mean fundamentally innocent, and he has been put in jail, and Crito is there to tell him, listen, we need to escape. And he's going to have to convince Socrates, because Socrates is a conversationalist, a philosopher, and he's really only going to listen to reason and reasonable arguments. So this is the first argument. If friends don't help a friend in need, then their inaction will appear shameful. So if you're a friend of someone and they have some need and you refuse to help them, then that's shameful. That's obvious, right? So if Socrates doesn't escape, then it will appear as if his friends didn't help him. You see, so he's kind of making a kind of shifty maneuver here to try to get to Socrates' conscience. So if it appears as if his friends didn't help him, then their inaction will appear shameful. All right? So this is the first argument, and this is the premises and the conclusion. So the next argument, the majority opinion argument, which is more of a kind of a summary of the ideas, is that, well, we need to take into account the opinion of the majority, because if we don't, they can hurt us. Okay, so we have two basic ideas here that, look, it's shameful to us if you don't escape, it will look bad at us, and we really need to worry about what the majority thinks because they can harm us. So Crito's basic idea is that, listen, Socrates, if you don't escape, you're going to be harming your friends. Okay, so, and I think this is important for Socrates. He places a lot of value in friendship, and so the idea of hurting his friends in some way would be sort of unacceptable to him, right? But let's see what he says. A few other arguments first. Crito notes he and his friends have the means to help him in exile, so if Socrates escapes, he will have to go to another one of the city-states that exist in Greece at the time, and in fact he'll have to go to Thessaly, and they have a place waiting for him. He also brings in a bit of a shame argument, a few. It would be unjust to forsake his wife and child through death, so he's basically going to be leaving them if he allows himself to be executed unjustly. And he says it's also very shameful to submit to this unjust sentence. Rather, you should confront it. And perhaps if you go away, you will have the opportunity to confront this unjust sentence. So you can live to fight another day is that basic idea. So this last argument is very serious, right? Because, and this is the key to the rest of the Crito dialogue, and really the central idea which makes this dialogue so historically important, as we'll see. Because Crito is saying that the judgment of the jury is unjust. And he's saying because it's unjust, you need to flee. You should refuse to obey. So think about that. A jury has made an unjust sentence, and the idea is that because of that, you have the right to flee. All right? Okay, so now let's look at Socrates' objections to this particular argument. So first of one, he says is, look, the opinion, the majority opinion is not valuable. Now remember, that Crito said the majority has the ability to harm us if they think badly. Okay? But he says, no, the opinion of the masses is not valuable. Rather, the opinion of the wise and the just is valuable. And here he offers what's called a parallel argument, and he does this a lot. He'll use a parallel example to show a particular point that he's trying to make. He says, for example, physical training. Who do we value? We don't value the advice of everybody. No, we value the advice of a skilled trainer, our coach, for example. Right? So the same thing would be said for medicine. We don't value just everyone's opinion, but we value the opinion of the doctor. He says, so too in affairs of justice, we shouldn't value just anyone's opinion. Rather, we should value the person skilled in just affairs, who is basically the wise and the just. So he's saying we don't need to listen to the opinion of the majority because they're not all necessarily just and their opinions are not all necessarily valuable. Rather, we should find those who are wise and listen to their opinion. Okay? So that's his first objection. The second objection he makes is that the unjust life is simply not worth living. So what he's saying here is that if I'm going to do something unjust, I have to be careful because I don't want to live a life of injustice. Okay? So this will bring up discussions that we will take in other areas. So the most important thing is not to live, but to live a good life, a just life. If he flees without acquittal, so if he flees without the jury saying it's okay, then he will be doing something unjust because he'll be breaking the laws of the state. This then leads to the main question, central question of the dialogue. This is the key question. Is it ever just or right for any case to disregard, and here, note, I emphasize this, the just laws of the state. So the assumption here is that the laws of Athens are just. And remember that, we're not talking about the decision of the jury. The jury has power. to make a decision. We're talking about the laws of Athens. We're saying the laws of Athens are just. And you can take a parallel example in the case of the U.S. The laws of the U.S., I'm supposing you would agree, are just laws. Now, if we go to court, we might be unjustly accused and go to jail. So the question is, do we have the right to break the law and flee because of that? So the problem is that the decision of the city and of the jury was not right. Okay, so basically, this is what's going on then, is that we have just laws, but we have an unjust decision. And so, but Socrates says, despite this, I can't flee. Because if the jury, even if the jury is not right, their judgment was nonetheless just. Why? Because they are empowered by the laws of the state to make a decision. Socrates, and look at this relationship, he submitted himself to those laws, and so he ought to submit to its judgments, even if wronged. So, the basic idea here is that in the U.S., if you're accused, and let's say falsely accused and sent to jail, the question is, would you have the right to break the laws and to flee? Okay, so it's going to lead to a number of problems if you do so. And here he gives some arguments in support of his claim that, well, he doesn't have the right to leave, that he submitted himself to the laws. Let's look at two of these. So the first is called the harm argument. First, one must never willingly do wrong or harm. Notice that this is an assumption. He's not saying, let's prove it. He's saying that this is self-evident. This is obvious. One should never willingly do wrong or harm. Second premise, to disregard the just laws of the state is to willingly do harm to those laws. Remember, they're just laws. They're not unjust laws. If they were unjust laws, it would be different. The decision is not right of the jury, but the laws which they're basing his eventual guilty accusation on are just. Okay? So if Socrates flees, then he will disregard the just laws of the state. In effect, he will be doing harm willingly to the law. Okay? So think about that argument, right? So you shouldn't harm, right? To disregard the laws of the state is to harm. If I flee, Socrates says, then I will disregard the laws of the state and harm it. Okay, so basically he's going to be disregarding the laws of his own state, harming his state. Right? The second is the social contract argument. Anyone who agrees to the just laws of a country ought to obey those laws. So do you agree? Do you live in this country? Do you accept our laws? Okay, especially the benefits? Then yes, you should obey those laws. Socrates agreed to the just laws of Athens. Therefore, he ought to obey those laws. This social contract argument is based upon what's called social contract theory. And it's this particular theory which is a socio-moral theory, which really makes this particular text so famous. So social contract theory is a theory that a person's social, moral, political obligations are the result, and here's the key, of an original contract or an agreement between the individual and the state. So social contract theory becomes very famous around the 17th century. We have Thomas Hobbes, for example, in his Leviathan, offering the basic idea that at the natural level we are pitted against each other, and so in order to sort of save ourselves, especially those who are weak, we have to gather together to form laws and original contract. And then from that, the state, the laws of the state, and even morality, which is in that latter case, that would be called contractarianism, even morality comes out of this. Okay, so he's not saying that latter aspect of contractarianism. He's just saying, listen, I agreed to the laws of the state. I benefited from these laws. Therefore, even if I receive an unjust sentence, I need to submit to it because I have respect for those laws. And again, think about it in the context of a parallel argument. We're living in the U.S. You were born and raised here. We all derived benefits from our life here, and so we ought to obey to the laws of the state, even if we disagree with the decision of a jury. Okay? Just a little side note here, and there's a video that you can watch that's associated with that. Note the transition from the is to the ought. This is the result of some theories of David Hume. the fact is that we benefited from our life here, right? And then from that, we conclude that therefore we ought to obey the laws of the state. So contract theory is based upon that. And again, watch that video just to see what this whole transition is about. So, some points of evidence. So remember, we're offering arguments, and we do this in philosophy, and then we offer evidence that supports our claims. So the first, if Socrates was displeased with the state, he could have left, right? So, and somebody could say that about the U.S. If you don't like our laws, leave, right? But Socrates never left, he says, except for military service. So that doesn't work for him. He chose to raise his children here, showing the state was beneficial. In other words, if you're going to raise those who are dearest to you and in the country that you think is best, then obviously you think the laws are good and beneficial. So he shouldn't flee, and indeed to do so would be shameful. In fleeing, and this is a nice, interesting argument, he will become an enemy of all governments. Why? Because they will say Socrates does not respect the law. And he didn't respect the law, the just laws in his own country or state, therefore he does not respect the just laws of any government. Another one, he will strengthen the conviction of the jury and his accusers who believe he is guilty. This is a lesser argument, but basically if he flees, they can say, look, there he is, he's disrespecting our just laws, and so Socrates must be someone who's certainly guilty. And finally, the gods will despise him in Hades. Hades was the Greek land of the dead. Hades is actually the god of the underworld, but it's normally called Hades now for the underworld. But it's actually the underworld. Despise him in the underworld, or the land of the dead where Hades reigns. Why? Because he'll be seen as an unjust man, and perhaps for this tossed into the pit, which was called Tartarus, where all of the truly evil were sent. So, in the end, Socrates refuses to leave, and after giving his arguments to Crito, and Crito leaves unhappily, and eventually Socrates is going to be executed, and he says, since this is the way the god or theos is leading us, this pointing to something like fate or destiny, and eventually, which not necessarily the case, I suppose if you say fate is giving into, is if you follow the just and the right, and it leads you in a direction, then this is your fate. But he could have chosen otherwise, so it's not actually fate. So he takes hemlock and he dies bravely discussing philosophy with his friends, and you can read about that again in Plato's Phaedo, and I would encourage you to do so.